As we move forward to reopening university campuses, questions are being raised about what type of campus helps preserve models of blended learning that have proved effective during the pandemic, and also how to implement changes to universities' estates that are both beneficial and sustainable. I'd like to thank the panel for joining me today. I think we've got a really nice mix of university and industry and government voices who can, I'm sure, all add something to our discussion. I wanted to start by asking how greener products and services can help reduce carbon footprints and costs. If anybody would like to get us started on that.
Hi, it's Joe. I'm happy to start on that, given my role as Deputy Director for Decarbonization. So lots of green products out there, and probably one of the best sites you can visit to find out which have been tested is something called the Energy Technology List. It's a website, and it's a program funded by Bayes that has, I think it's 14,000 different products across just about every area you can think of. And these provide, they've been regularly tested and certified. And so organizations that use them can be confident that they will provide energy efficiency savings. That would probably be my first go-to place. But then wider, you probably need to speak to your estate's people. They have, full sight of all the assets on the premises, and they will be able to very easily come up with a list of projects and kit that they believe should be renewed. Easy things are obviously lighting, HVAC, and depending on the site, if you have the available space, your own energy generation.
Great, thank you very much. Andy, if I could come to you next, please. So for those who don't know, APUC is the procurement centre of expertise for universities and colleges in Scotland. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on, what green products and services have you seen being adopted on a national level, perhaps? Are there any trends that are emerging already?
I think it's an emerging landscape. What we're seeing is a vision to different types of build. People are looking at a passive house. We've already had BM Excellence, etc. come in. They're now looking at the materials that are involved in the build process. In some cases, that's a switch to timber. And obviously there's various considerations within there, but that's timber from sustainable sources. And then in terms of, can that be renewed? What's the lifetime of those products, etc. We measure a lot of what we do by the different levels. So there's the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And scope 3 is a big impact, and DEFRA figures are used to calculate those for construction. I think they're a bit barn door technology, so there's an awful lot to be done to develop that. But anything we can do to take that material and ensure that what we're putting in place has a low carbon footprint will help the overall view as well. In terms of fit out, etc., people are certainly looking towards the ability to extend the life of the materials that they're putting in place and trying to build in the total whole life cost or whole life view of a product. So it's not just the original carbon footprint, it's what will it take to run that building then for the next 30, 40 years and how adaptable that's been. We've seen a massive adaptation programme in the higher and further education sector over the last 20 years. And we certainly expect that to continue, if not as part of the natural process. Certainly, I think COVID has driven a lot of changes in terms of the delivery of education, and we'll see that adapting. So anything we can do that allows that flexibility will reduce the overall carbon footprint in the lifetime of a building as well.
Thanks very much. Michelle, can I come to you next? I thought it'd be quite interesting to hear your perspective as somebody who's on staff at the university and working on these kind of programs.
Just going to say, completely agree with what Andy's just said. And at the beginning, you mentioned about the renewal, and I think it's very important to bring in that reuse perspective. We need to make sure our buildings and our campuses are contributing to our target to be net zero carbon by 2040 and our vision of a circular economy. I think previously a lot of the focus of carbon reduction strategies has been on the emissions that occur when buildings are actually used as sort of operational emissions. And as Andy just mentioned and touched on, a lot more work needs to get done, is starting to get done on actually the carbon emitted during the construction and during the maintenance and the choice of materials that we might use, and obviously, or that materials that we could reuse as well too as part of that process.
Okay, great, thank you. Joe, just to come back to Crown Commercial Services role in this and how it tends to work across the sector, is the general uptake for, are you seeing the appetite in, is it becoming easier to communicate these products and services across to the higher education sector? I mean, generally, are people building it into their strategy right from the start across the board?
Yeah, so I'll let John answer the start of the process in the construction of new education buildings. But once the buildings are up and then basically comes into my world of hey, what can we do? So we tend to assist. Obviously, there's a funding issue, which is probably the biggest single criteria right now. There is an appetite for this, but funds are a challenge, especially again, as Andy mentioned, COVID, which has meant like a lot of foreign students are no longer here who pay full price. And so universities have been severely impacted on that lack of funding. There are energy performance contracts that can be used, but then chief financial officers have to be engaged because there's accounting treatment to be done. But the word is getting out. We do have and recently developed an education strategy, which we regularly share. We communicate with about 1,100 to 1,200 different customers who we supply energy to and provide them regular updates and all the different products and services we can use to assist them. And some of them were successful in attaining funds from, it's called the Public Sector Decarbonization Scheme. I think government put out about £1 billion worth of that. And I think that got snapped up in literally about a couple of months. There's a part 2 of that coming down the line, so that should help ease some of the funding criteria. But yes, there is an appetite. It's the financing that is the challenge for them right now.
That's completely understandable, I think. John, if we can come to you next, I just would like to ask you a bit more about how your work is involved with supporting sort of how engineering, procurement and construction all feed into this process, and how important is it to adopt a more collaborative working approach as universities are being put under more pressure than ever before to evaluate their physical spaces?
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. Yeah, I mean, firstly, I agree with everything the panel said so far. The operation of a building takes up, or the whole life cost of a building, apologies, is about 80% of if it's OPEX cost. So the products that go into a building or into the construction of a building are so important. And we're seeing more and more departments, education sector in particular now, focusing their designs on a more whole life cost perspective. But to Joe's point, the funding is an issue, and the funding isn't just an issue because it might not be available now. The funding is also an issue because of whether it's annualised funding or 2-year funding doesn't allow necessarily the investment up front into these long-term strategies to support a more sustainable building and operation as well. So there's lots of constraints around the funding element. However, to your question, the engineering, procure and construct plays a massive part. So what we do with our customers at the moment is talk them through how they can approach their design by utilising the specialist contractors far earlier in the process. So whether that's a main tier 1 contractor who might be building something, or whether it's a specialist around energy efficiency. If we break that down into more simpler things like renewables, then bring those specialists into the conversations with the engineering partners far earlier than perhaps what they would have used to be doing. And that way, the designs are developed more efficiently with a whole life cost and an energy effective perspective. But also, that allows then the procurer or the procurement teams to factor all of that into their evaluation models as well. So less so about quantitative assessments, but more about qualitative assessments as well. What type of efficient material or products are being used? Maybe even assess those quantitatively as well from a whole life cost perspective. So we're seeing a shift change, but there are some constraints, I would say, that still exist that are stopping customers, the departments, to think in a more broader way.
Okay, thank you very much. Sophie, I think this would be a really good time to come to you, just because I know that obviously you lead the implementation of sustainability schemes through your work at Balfour Beatty, and that involves managing specialists and working directly with businesses. How is your work changing during this period, and what is the general direction of travel?
I think the direction of travel is that obviously we need to continue and increase focus on the sustainability outputs of the work that we do. And listening into the conversation, I completely agree with all of the points raised. Actually, one of the greatest challenges that we face in terms of increasing the sustainability outputs of a project is the fact that we have to, in places, look at only certain elements in terms of dealing with the costs or the view or the decisions we're making about the construction of a building. Like John just mentioned, actually, the further left we are, the earlier that we can involved in the construction of a building, the earlier we can bring our specialists in, the earlier that we can implement tools such as we recently have developed an embodied carbon calculator, which is actually a plug-in to the Revit model. And what it does is automatically calculates the carbon, the embodied carbon of that building, so we can highlight the carbon hotspots. But to highlight the carbon hotspots, we then have to identify an alternative lower carbon option. And the earlier we're involved in the process, the greater the options that we have in terms of increasing the sustainability or reducing the carbon of the asset. And I think I just wanted to touch on the point earlier as well, in terms of the various different sections in which different people own sustainability or perhaps own or have influence on the asset. I think one of the things that we're looking at increasingly is how we actually hand over what we're doing and how we connect with higher up the chain and further along the chain in terms of that asset. Because actually, I think to improve or increase the sustainability outcomes, we have to have a completely collaborative approach with anyone who may be involved in that asset and share the challenges so that we're actually working together in a coordinated way.
Great, thank you. Michelle, if I could come to you just to ask a bit more about what those outputs look like. So the programs that you're in charge of at Edinburgh, you are absolutely focused on meeting strategic goals for the university. Is it a case that by getting involved, taking a more holistic approach and becoming more involved earlier in the process, you can refine those goals, or is it about communicating them to the other parties involved? How does it, what I suppose I'm asking is, how do you give yourself the best chance to succeed on all the metrics that you set yourself for a project?
Thank you, Alistair. Fantastic question. So the programs I work on are really a lot around our staff and our student and our community engagement. And so raising awareness and making change and working closely with colleagues in finance and colleagues with estates and colleagues with procurement on really embedding and integrating sustainability. Because we do know that we need to make sure our buildings and our campuses are contributing to our targets of being net zero by 2040 and the vision of a circular economy. And agree with comments that have been said about, really good data is really critical for that. We don't always see that the intent of a building maybe came through to life in terms of the performance. And we know that good metering is key, and we've invested a lot in terms of that. We know that carbon data is key and that waste data is key. But also, and these are some of the things that we work on, is how do we involve our researchers who have expertise on these issues and our students who have expertise on these issues and want to get involved in challenge-based projects to also see the university as a living lab. Now, that doesn't always align with the timelines needed for, say, for a particular building project. But with the support of the Scottish Funding Council and with partners, we've been working on a project to see how building projects are designed, how they're managed, and how they're implemented through those different decisions, thinking alongside that process to gather some research and to gather some evidence. We obviously have a fairly large estate. We're about 500 buildings. Some of those are historic. And as a large and research-intensive university, we use a lot of energy. Obviously, for our laboratories, use a lot of energy, and for heat on our campuses. And one challenge for us, of course, we benefit from being in Scotland and the UK and using grid electricity that is decarbonised, but also we've invested in the past in CHPs and combined heat and power, which previously helped to contribute to our carbon targets, but no longer do as the grid is decarbonised. And I think that's a real challenge, for not just for our campuses, but for campuses across the UK, is the decarbonisation of the heat as well, and the challenges that brings.
Okay, thanks very much. Sophie, I see you nodding. These are sort of conversations that you are finding yourself having increasingly more with universities? You have a mix of new and old buildings that need attention?
Yeah, I am nodding away at what Michelle is highlighting, because actually it perfectly emphasises that point of how connected we have to be. Because actually, if we look at if we have a project and it's handed across to us, and actually the decisions around how that building is powered are already made, then that limits the outputs, the sustainable outputs that we can deliver through that. So as Michelle highlights, I think that it's really important that we take that step back and we actually have a more collaborative view and tackle the greatest challenges first, such as how are we going to move towards renewable electricity or renewable options to actually power buildings where actually they may not be set up, or in a location where they even have access to those facilities at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Andy, I was wondering if you could come to you to ask you a little bit more about procurement, and just in terms of setting priorities for big projects and deciding where funding is best placed. Do universities present a unique set of challenges to people who are trying to decarbonise and make things more sustainable because of their mix of assets and because of the type of people who are using them?
I don't think it's unique. I mean, if you speak to local authorities, they'll tell you they've possibly got the same mix of assets and same issues that they're looking to do. I think one of the major differences is our key stakeholders are very idealistic and very challenging, and I think that's a good thing. They drive us forward, so we don't get to sit back and rest on our laurels of the last project. They're constantly demanding change going forward and innovation, because that's what they want to be involved in, and that's what they expect of the people that are delivering their education. So I think it is. I think the balance we've got is constantly meeting that expectation. We look at the student well-being, etc. Student experience is a large part of what we deliver. So anything we deliver has to be in line with that. So making something the most efficient has to be blended with making sure that experience is a good experience, and when Michelle was talking about heat sources, etc. In terms of procurement, we can go out and buy pretty much anything, but if we don't know what we're going to buy, so future-proofing is very hard. And we're sitting with an estate where we are aware that, if we look at backlog maintenance, the cost involved in that is quite dramatic. If we don't start to build some of those elements into the construction of today and tomorrow, all we are doing is creating a problem that we're going to have in another 10, 15, 20 years down the line. I wouldn't say it's unique. I would say it's possibly just different. And the expectation is that we should be leading the way rather than perhaps following the pack.
Okay. And are there examples you think of sort of new ideas that are being put out by people in the sector, people working in universities, that are proving popular?
There's a lot of discussions as to what the best answer is. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know that. That's not my job. But there is a lot of discussions about different designs, different heat sources that we've talked about. There's certainly a drive within the sector, both nationally and in Scotland, to try and develop what could potentially be the heat sources of the future and build that in. Or if we haven't got to that point, allow for adaptation of those so we move. And that has to be done in conjunction with local colleagues in the public sector. So in terms of heat networks, etc., you can't do that alone as a university. You very much have to do that in connection with your local authorities, your health authorities, and social housing, because social housing is a large part of that solution as well.
Okay, thank you. John, if I come to you next, how much does this point to the challenges ahead for universities in terms of deciding what the mix of space is going to be on their campuses when they come back? Because it seems to be something there's been a huge amount of success with delivering blended learning, that mix of online and in person, but also during that period there's also clearly a huge desire for people to get back on campuses, but start using the space in a different way. Does that put a renewed pressure, not just on funding, but also on the type of strategic thinking that universities have to do?
I think it does. I think we're all in a unique position, aren't we? Certainly over the past 12 months now, where we've been introduced to remote working, and students are no different. And I think universities are going to need to think differently about utilising that space. So Andy made the point there about student well-being. So that's just as important to what we're talking about here as well, because if there's a unique space and it's used in the right way by the education sector, then that will start attracting students back into campus more. I think for me personally, I'm looking forward to going back out into the open and experiencing that again. But I think that balance with the education sector is actually offering probably a far greater opportunity for students right across definitely the country, but also the world now, to access things remotely. So there's different revenue streams that universities need to think about that way, and offset that against the balance of utilising the space that they have in such a way that still attracts the local students or students from within a particular region to want to come out to campus, and modernise that. I think we're absolutely talking about energy efficiency here and sustainability, and that's the right things. But I think if we focus on particular sectors within the university as well, so the subject matters, I think you can actually utilise the students in such a way that would help develop the right spatial living quarters or education sectors that exist that they felt part of developing, and therefore have a vested interest in wanting to come to use as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you make an interesting point about student accommodation. It's certainly something that's been covered a lot in THE over the past few months, in terms of how the demand for student halls is changing and how it may sort of continue to change permanently as a result of all of this. Michelle, is that something that's been part of the conversations you've been having within your remit?
Not within my remit, so no, I wouldn't be able to comment too much on that. We do have students obviously currently and still on site, and I think COVID has taught us as an organization that we can do things differently. And so I think that earlier comment about bringing these issues into the strategic framing of the university is absolutely crucial. If I think about travel a few years ago, having different conversations now, and obviously all of us here today, than we would have had a few years ago, where someone might have said, no, it's absolutely imperative for my work that I must travel to Beijing by plane, every month. And now maybe it's like, well, actually, I've realized I can do this remotely. I can engage remotely. And for us, business travel is actually a key part of our carbon footprint, and is in scope and isn't immaterial. It's about 20% of our carbon footprint. So I think COVID is forcing us to think about things, and as we build back better, we need to build back exponentially better so that nature and people can flourish. I think it's been a really tough year for university students this year. I live with an 18-year-old, my son, who's thinking about going to university next year, and I wonder what type of environment he might be in as well too, and what sort of things will be in place. I'm guessing that there will still be some social distancing restrictions, won't there, that we'll be planning for as part of our campuses. But I think it's been a really tough year for students this year.
Absolutely. Sophie, if I come to you just to ask a little bit more about the specialists that you work with. I know this is a difficult question to answer because it hasn't happened yet, but in terms of the challenge of changing the uses of space on campus, so perhaps not needing as many lecture theatres, perhaps not needing the same amount of halls of residence as you did before, perhaps needing slightly different spaces on campus for social activities or different study areas, or the things that people have struggled with over lockdown has not necessarily been access to devices, that is a problem, but also access to spaces in which they can work and study reliably. So is this something that you can offer advice on in terms of changing the use of spaces as much as anything else?
I think if you don't mind me adding first, I just wanted to echo some of the points that have recently been made, and that we recognise that actually well-being is incredibly important for students, and we actually deliver, we have long-term relationships with student accommodation delivery, and actually we frequently visit and look at, has the building that we designed, is it being used in the way that we designed it? and is the building performing as we designed it to perform? And actually we've learned some really interesting things from that, in that actually the users have to be happy and they have to be conscious of how to use their building to actually ensure that you can get the best out of the design or the building that they're actually operating within. So I think that well-being, that knowledge, that education piece is incredibly important here. In terms of your reference, Alistair, of flexible spaces, that is something that is on our radar. And as I mentioned earlier, the earlier we're involved with projects, the more support that we can actually provide. And the specialists that we have in the company range in discipline from an entire energy management unit who will look at how various different iterations of design may impact on the energy performance of a building, to obviously in-house design teams and design specialists with a wide range of projects that we work on, including student accommodation.
Okay, thank you very much. Joe and John, I was wondering if either of you could speak about whether a wellbeing provision is currently included in frameworks and the advice that you're giving to the sector, or is this something that you anticipate will be changing in the future?
So yeah, Joe, I'll come in on that first, if that's okay. So yeah, wellbeing is embedded within certainly the agreements that we have in place, and that might be through the well-being initiatives that we have in terms of the industry itself and the legislation that's wrapped around that. But as we move more towards procuring for outcomes as opposed to outputs, the focus is shifting absolutely on that kind of social value element, which obviously includes well-being and the importance of what an outcome can be and what needs to be achieved from a client's requirements plays a key part in the usability or the impact of what that requirement actually is. I think to Sophie's point there, measuring the performance of that asset and the usability of it, comparing that back to a business case and justification why that requirement is needed is really important. We're definitely seeing a shift away from the fact that we might need a building to house X number of students, more to actually how can we develop an outcome that is effective for students, effective for the lecturers, and effective for all employees around to deliver the better outcome for that individual and that university. And I think I didn't touch upon something earlier before on the better use of space. It's the consideration of what's in and around that environment, that local situation that universities may find themselves in developing other parts of the urban areas. Andy touched upon working closely with local authorities. Well, there could be an opportunity to combine urban regeneration with university development as well, which is really important. So it's taking that step back and really partnering, working collaboratively with other public sector authorities and the suppliers alike to deliver exactly something that achieves a massive outcome in the social value element.
Great, thank you. That leads in nicely to one of the questions that we've had from the audience. I say we are taking questions, so if you do have any, please just drop them in the box for us. And it's from Sarah Boyer, who says, how can we implement a sustainable urban mobility strategies on universities, and especially with universities located in the city? Obviously, this requirement changes depending on what type of university you are, but Andy, I was wondering if you had have there been any thoughts on that from universities in different locations that you've dealt with? Oh, sorry, you're on mute. Yeah.
No, it's okay. Yeah. Could I ask you to repeat the first part of the question?
Sure, no problem. It was how can we implement sustainable urban mobility strategies on universities? So I guess it's asking a bit more about civic engagement and making use of universities' location.
Yep. I think some of that's already in process. In Scotland, we have a process called City Deals, where we are already engaging with local authorities and other public sector bodies as well. But that's to go back to John's point about urban regeneration, etc., and to drive change and then social value as an outcome from that. That's very much integrated. So that is not just creating a property or an extension as a standalone body, but then to integrate that as part of a regeneration programme, and then to look at multi-use space as well. I mean, I think universities are actually quite good at engaging with community and opening properties up where feasible for community use. and also delivering part of the social value package, because that's core to their outcome agreements with the Scotland Funding Council. But I think certainly in a city situation where space for development is tight and we don't want to see the encroachment onto green or even further brown sites, then what we need to do is we need to adapt what we've got. And I think that very much feeds back into what we were talking before about the adaptability of properties. Before it was about classroom delivery, now it's about education delivery. And I think that education goes slightly wider than just universities, and that can then start to include local communities and other facilities as well.
Great, thank you. Michelle, yeah, I was actually going to come to you next to ask a bit more about community engagement and how this forms an important part of that.
I think linked to the question on mobility, it's about, obviously, as universities and as campuses, we're embedded with and working with our communities and our partners. And I think we've seen through the coronavirus that there's been more interest as well too from citizens, from students, from staff on taking up cycling. We've worked many years and over with different partners on making sure that cycling is attractive, it's safe and it's secure, and it's not something for everyone. Of course, that's only part of that mobility picture, but investing a lot in even things like for students, bike maintenance courses, for staff, a cycle to work scheme, and sort of working with city partners to see the campuses as part of an integrated community, and that's been key to that also.
Okay, thank you. Sophie, have you seen any particularly strong examples of civic engagement in the universities that you've worked with?
I think there are various different examples. There aren't kind of any one particular which jumps to mind, which would be worth me going into in more detail as a response to that. But I think it would be, what I would like to add is that actually social value is incredibly important. There are obviously various different ways to measure it, and I think there is an element of race to the biggest number in terms of an output. But actually, we've seen real value in identifying the specific social value that certain communities require. I think this links back to other points that we've actually discussed in terms of if you're doing initial research into a community, there are no two projects which we delivered which we've done the exact same social value delivery. And actually what we learn through the social value, the connections that we build, the time we spend in the communities, the facilities that we work with, is incredibly valuable information that we can actually build into our projects and share with other partners and local authorities as well.
Okay, thank you. John, I was wondering if I could ask you a bit more about building for the future and how much all of these elements filled in, because we've spoken a little bit about future proofing when we talk about these undertaking these big projects. Is it a case of absolutely sort of embedding the social impact, the flexibility of space, and the sustainability on top of that? Does it make it very difficult to succeed if you're not going to include everything at that planning stage?
Good question.
I suppose what I'm asking in a way is sort of the common challenges that people run into, because obviously it's easy for us to talk in abstract about what everybody should be doing, but it can be difficult to coordinate all of those things into a whole.
It can. Thanks for clarifying. It can. However, I think somebody made the point before with any sort of funding requirements or restrictions, you need to build in that many different elements now to funding justifications, which drives your thought process differently. So traditionally, a client, a designer would think very traditionally. It would be a concrete box, with very minimal constraints around what was needed or how they needed to deliver a requirement. And I'm generalizing there. But obviously moving forward and where we sit today, there's that many different considerations around modern method techniques, the off-site manufacturing elements. So things can be done 100 miles away from where the actual site or the located site is going to be, which has a positive impact on the environment, increases employment in other areas of the country. So there's a driver from that perspective. There's absolutely the driver from the social value piece that we talked about, or we've certainly touched upon here today. And importantly, I think for me, one difficult battle I think the clients have and the designers face with themselves at the moment is trying to think outside of the box. So trying to think now from an energy efficiency perspective as well. So CDM was brought in a long time ago around designing for safety. We need to take that methodology really and design for sustainability. You know, how do we even think about the maintenance properly of the asset that we're currently designing for, whatever that is, building or infrastructure. Bring the end users in far more, I think, as well, to break some of those barriers down. And the end user in this context can be a student, it can be a lecturer, it can be the operations and maintenance service providers. So I think it is difficult. I think the balance is difficult. But I actually think a lot of the chinks in the chain are starting to click together, starting with the planning applications that are driving you in a different way to what a traditional would do, with the funding applications the same. And then the obvious pressure that I think clients are under now to deliver something from a sustainable perspective, understandably so, given the legislative targets that we've got.
I think we've had another question from the audience, which is basically, I'm concerned about revising our approach mid-crisis, which I think is something we spoke about right at the top of the hour. And how do we revise our approaches to communicate better? Is it a case of you're going to have to work on a slightly shorter time frame in the interim period while we're still waiting to see how campuses reopen? Is it harder to plan for the future at the moment because of that? Is it more sensible to set deliverables for slightly shorter term projects? Does that make life easier for universities while they're still changing how they do business in such a fundamental way?
Is that a question for me, Alistair?
Yeah, you can jump in. Yeah, please. Yeah.
I didn't want to, but I will do.
Well, everyone looks very relieved that you have, so please.
So I think, yeah, I mean, it will. I think the impact of COVID has affected everybody differently, but also in a common way. So the stop, start, continue process has probably gone through a lot of people's minds, personally and professionally. And I think that's no different in business. So in a university's perspective now, you know, how are they rationally thinking about, you know, displaying the courses that still need to be delivered for the benefit of the students? And you know, that's going to need to take a short, medium, and long-term view and approach. And you know, within that is probably going to mean a transition from sort of remote working in a digital way that we are doing, through to refreshing the halls of residence, refreshing the you know, the university buildings that are on offer at the moment, to get and invite students back in who will be apprehensive, but at the same time, I think, you know, certainly the era of students coming through at the moment, you know, really genuinely care about our environment and our world, and you know, have a huge part to play in that. So we'll no doubt be forthcoming with their opinions as well.
Okay, thank you. Joe, I just wanted to ask you a bit more about decarbonisation and working on projects of different sizes and different scopes. How much do the challenges change when you're talking about a local project versus a national versus something that has maybe international elements to it as well?
Yeah, good question. So 2015, I built, you know, I led a team that built what was then the largest, you know, solar park in the UK. And we were able to do that in just shy of 4 months, because we were fighting the deadline, which was the removal of the feed-in tariffs. So I remember we had about 1,000 people on the site, you know, putting this together, and that was fine. And then a year later, I'm trying to work on building or making one of the military bases the greenest military base in the country, and that took me 2 years. You know, it's quite. From a public sector point of view, the biggest barrier I have found from projects is internal approvals process. There are times when they can move really fast, and there are times when they can move really, really slow. But I think Andy touched on something that's what I'm currently trying to do, which is around trying to get, as an example, an education establishment to say, if you are going to look to do something in your neighborhood, please don't consider just your own facilities. Look around you and engage. Maybe there's a hospital near you, a prison near you, whatever. There might be some other buildings near you where you can, work together and come up with a better, sizable project that'll be more beneficial to the community. We're trying to get the state's teams from both sides or multiple areas, plus, finance officers from multiple areas to, come together and work together to achieve this has been really, really challenging. But on the most, no. As far as we're dealing with a single organization across multiple sites, the biggest thing I always talk to them is benefits realization, which goes back to the well-being part. It's not just about putting up a, the outside light. You would all have heard the stories of a particular local council that changed their, street lights to LED lights, and it then impacted on the sleeping patterns of the people nearby, because it was shining there and they could, into their rooms and they couldn't sleep and it was too bright. So yes, they've done a great thing and great for them. They reduced their, carbon, and the energy consumption, but not so much good for the well-being of the residents of that street. So it depends on single approver, nice and easy, even if it's across multiple sites. Multiple approver, even close together, always significantly more challenging.
Okay, thank you very much. Sophie, we've got a couple of minutes left. I was wondering if I could ask you a question about what have you found being the factors that cause the biggest variation in terms of how long it takes to complete a project?
Yeah, and actually I'm going to pick up on what Joe said as well, because one of the greatest challenges we have is actually conflicting requirements in sustainability itself. And that can cause delays and increase the time that we need to spend on getting things right. So just to kind of give you a bit of an example, let's take full fabric energy efficiency standard, which essentially would like a really well-insulated a cube is the design that it would like a building to be as efficient as form as possible. And on the same project, we'll have a daylighting requirement. And that will mean that it would like really big windows to let in all the sun. And actually, fabric energy efficiency doesn't really like that, because it would rather you had no windows. And then if you add to the mix overheating, when we're looking at meeting overheating criteria, well, that would really like windows in certain places to pick up sun at certain times of the day. So that is one of the things that can cause extensions in the amount of time and the focus that we have to have on the design process. And I think that really emphasizes why it's so important that we can engage as early as possible and give that the time it needs, because I think there's a brilliant graph. I'm sure it has a name. I can't remember what the name of the graph is, but it shows how actually at the early stages you can really maximize the sustainability outcome of a building, that as you move through a project you can actually reduce those outcomes. But by focusing and giving that upfront early stages of a project the time it really needs, it may take longer, but you could have some improved outcomes. So,
Great, thank you very much. That pretty much takes us up to time, so I think it's a good point at which to end it. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for taking the time to join us today and contributing their expertise. I think it's been really interesting to hear a variety of perspectives about this. So thank you all very much for taking part, and thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us.